Tensions in the Strait of Hormuz spiked on Sunday, April 13th, as the United States moved ahead with a newly announced naval blockade intended to choke off Iran's maritime commerce and pressure Tehran after another round of talks failed to produce a breakthrough. President Donald Trump, speaking a day earlier on April 12th, framed the operation as an enforcement step aimed at Iranian-linked shipping and any international trade routes that, in Washington's view, are helping Iran sustain itself economically during the war. The administration said the blockade would begin at a defined time, 10 a.m. Eastern on April 13th, turning one of the world's most vital energy corridors into an immediate test of credibility, logistics, and escalation control. But almost as soon as the deadline arrived, reports circulated that at least one previously U.S.-sanctioned vessel had moved through the strait anyway, raising questions about what blockade meant in practice, which ships would be stopped and way. There, the U.S. Navy intended to physically interdict traffic at the choke point or rely on a mix of warnings, inspections, and targeted enforcement. The vessel at the center of the early controversy was a partially loaded tanker identified as the Elpis. According to reporting that cited U.S. military monitoring of the waterway, the ship successfully transited the Strait of Hormuz on April 13th after the blockade had been declared active. The Elpis had previously been sanctioned by the United States over alleged links to Iran's shadow oil trading network, an ecosystem of front companies, reflagging, opaque ownership structures, and evasive shipping practices used to move oil and related cargo outside official channels. Its passage quickly became symbolic. Supporters of the operation argued that one ship slipping through did not prove a failure, especially if the U.S. mission was focused on deterrence, pressure, and selective enforcement rather than stopping every hull that moved. Critics ramed it as day one embarrassment, a headline example of how hard it is to impose a sweeping maritime cordon in a crowded, economically essential cordon without triggering a broader conflict. Around the strait, the operational reality appeared messy and cautious. Commercial shipping patterns shifted almost immediately as companies tried to understand what the U.S. rules would be, what Iran might do in response, and what the insurance and security implications would be for any ship that attempted to pass. Some vessels reportedly turned back shortly after the announced deadline. One tanker, described as Botswana registered and identified as the Oster IAA, altered course away from the area not long after the blockade start time. Another ship, the Rich Starry, was reported lingering near Iran's Keshem Island, effectively pausing rather than committing to a transit. Tracking data cited in coverage suggested a broader logjam, numerous vessels waiting on either side of the choke point, with operators reluctant to sail into a narrowing corridor where a miscalculation could mean boarding, seizure, or attack. The stakes are enormous. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow strip of water, it is a pressure point for global energy flows. Even the perception of instability can move prices, and the combination of war, disrupted traffic, and threatened interdiction created the conditions for immediate market anxiety. As the blockade began, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps signaled it was prepared to treat foreign military activity in the area as provocation. Iranian messaging portrayed Tehran as the party controlling the passageway, with assertions that only certain civilian ships would be allowed through under conditions Iran itself sets and monitors. Iran's posture, at least publicly, sought to flip the script, portraying the U.S. as the destabilizer and Iran as the authority deciding who may pass. At the same time, Tehran delivered direct warnings aimed at U.S. and allied militaries. The IRGC Navy issued language suggesting that a single misstep could pull American forces into a destructive trap, an image designed to deter and to communicate that Iran would not simply watch a U.S. declared cordon tighten around its ports. Iran also argued that foreign warships attempting to move through the strait would violate a two-week ceasefire that, according to accounts in the broader coverage, had been agreed to on April 7th. Only for subsequent talks to collapse. Iran's position implied that American naval movements were not defensive but escalatory, and that Washington was undermining any remaining pathway back to diplomacy. U.S. officials, meanwhile, described their naval activity as part of ongoing regional operations that included mine clearance efforts. In the days just before the blockade's formal start, U.S. accounts said 2 American destroyers transited the strait in the April 1112 window, with the stated aim of ensuring commercial lanes were safe and that mines were not blocking passage. In Iran's telling, those movements didn't happen as Washington described. Iranian statements disputed that U.S. warships made a clean transit, claiming American vessels attempted to enter the corridor but turned back under pressure, allegedly after encountering threats such as missile targeting and drones in the narrow waterway. The conflicting narratives underscore the central risk of the moment, not only the danger of kinetic confrontation, but the informational fog that often surrounds contested seas during wartime, where each side seeks to project strength and deny the other legitimacy. In Washington, President Trump insisted the blockade was working and that Iran was already reeling. In one extended set of remarks, he portrayed Iran's maritime forces as crippled and argued the blockade would be economically decisive. He also suggested that ships were seeking to exploit American oil access and that enforcement would tighten over time. President Trump, discussing the state of the conflict and the blockade timeline, said, I would say it's holding well. Their military is destroyed. Their whole Navy is underwater. You know that 158 ships are gone. Their Navy's gone. Most of their mine droppers are gone. We have a lot of people, as you know. At 10 o'clock tomorrow, we have a blockade going into effect. That'll be 10 o'clock tomorrow. Other nations are working so that Iran will not be able to sell oil, and that will be very effective. He described what he claimed was a workaround being used by vessels attempting to access oil without going through Hormuz, and he implied that behavior would be corrected. President Trump said, but what we want to do is we want to, and again, we don't need it, what we notice and what we see, and what I think is maybe my idea, maybe not, I don't know, but there are many boats heading toward our country to fill up with oil and then go and take it. So we're not going to go through the Hormuz Strait, and ultimately that'll be corrected, but in the meantime, they're using us. He then pivoted to domestic production claims as proof the U.S. could withstand an energy shock even if the region destabilized further. President Trump said, we have more oil because of drill, baby, drill. We have more oil than Russia and Saudi Arabia put together. He framed Iran as desperate and claimed deep U.S. situational awareness of the war, including an extraordinarily long meeting. President Trump said, I think Iran is in very bad shape. I think they're very desperate. We had a meeting that lasted 21 hours. We understand the situation better than anybody, and Iran's in very bad shape. He also repeated a central red line nuclear weapons, using blunt language about what he said the U.S. would not allow. President Trump said, and just so you understand, Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. We will not have, there is no way that. They're going to get, they still want it, and they made that clear the other night. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, and when asked about the prospect of Iran returning to negotiations, he dismissed the need for continued talks. President Trump said, I don't know. I don't care if they come back or not. If they don't come back, I'm fine. He argued that Iran's missile and drone capacity had been degraded and suggested the U.S. had restrained itself in terms of infrastructure while accusing Iran of breaking promises. President Trump said, their missiles are largely depleted. The manufacturing capability for missiles and drones is largely defeated. We've been very nice. We haven't ripped down too many bridges. We did one only because they broke their word. They broke their promise. And remember, their promise was that they were going to open the Hormuz Strait. They didn't do it. They lied. Beyond the immediate naval drama, economic messaging because part of the battlefield. Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Qualibaf issued a warning framed for American consumers that gasoline prices could climb further and that Americans might look back at today's prices with regret if the standoff continued to intensify. The transcript's claims about U.S. gasoline costs and oil price spikes reflected the broader atmosphere of volatility, an environment where energy markets react not only to supply disruptions, but to the threat of disruption, to insurance and shipping costs, and to the possibility that the world's most important oil choke point could become effectively semi-closed. Still, amid the flood of claims, contradictions, and wartime rhetoric, the situation on the water appeared to be defined by hesitation as much as action. Ships slowing, turning back, clustering outside the corridor, and waiting for clarity about whether the U.S. intended to enforce a hard stop or whether this blockade would function more like a selective interdiction regime with warnings and targeted seizures rather than an attempt to physically halt every vessel. Iran's posture suggested it would try to turn any American interdiction into an international legitimacy fight, portraying U.S. actions as illegal aggression while simultaneously keeping enough leverage over the strait to make global markets feel the pressure. Washington's posture suggested it was betting that maritime pressure plus coalition support and the threat of interception on global seas could squeeze Iran's revenue and force a strategic decision in Tehran. Then, layered over all of it, an unexpected political and cultural flashpoint erupted. President Trump expanded his public anger to include Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope, in remarks that blended foreign policy, domestic politics, and personal grievance. In the transcript's closing portion, President Trump attacked Pope Leo by name and ideology, tying his criticism of the pontiff to crime, nuclear weapons, and the war. President Trump said, asterisk, we don't like a pope that's going to say that it's okay to have a nuclear weapon. We don't want a pope that says crime is okay in our cities. I don't like it. I'm not a big fan of Pope Leo. He's a very liberal person, and he's a man that doesn't believe in stopping crime. He's a man that doesn't think that we should be toying with a country that wants to nuclear their weapons so they can blow up the world. I'm not a fan of Pope Law. The broader effect of that outburst was to widen the conflict's footprint beyond the battlefield and the shipping lanes, turning it into a dispute over moral authority and public persuasion at a moment when global attention is fixed on the Strait, on the price of oil, and on whether the world is heading toward a deeper regional war or a fragile off-ramp back to negotiations. For now, the Strait of Hormuz remains the central stage, a narrow channel where a single sanctioned ship's transit can become a global. Headline, where competing claims of control are weaponized in real time, and where the next decisive development may not be a missile launch, but a boarding attempt, a misread radar contact, or a commercial captain forced to choose between turning back and pushing forward into contested water.